Okay, welcome. Good morning. So this video is part 2 of the phenomenology of reading. In part 1, we looked at, in general terms, the issue of interpretation. Number 1, what is interpretation? Something like translating a text into your own words, or translating the thought that's behind the words of the text. And then we talked about why interpretation is required, why it's so necessary, right? So today I'd like to talk about, more specifically, the phenomenology of reading as such. I'm going to talk about the very process of reading and some key elements to it. First of all, again, what do we mean by phenomenology? A fancy Greek word, phenomenon, has to do actually with appearances, the way things appear to us subjectively in our own experience. It has to do with the way we experience things from the first person point of view. So therefore, the phenomenology of reading is what the experience of reading is like and actually consists of, and the mechanics of what's actually happening when you do it. Now, when we spell some of these mechanics out, like what's actually involved in reading, it's not going to be a surprise to you. You're going to go, duh, professor, like, of course that's what you do when you read. But the point is this, that when you typically read, you don't really think consciously about specifically what's going on. And that is part of, for lack of a better word, a deficiency in one's own reading. One has to be particularly aware of what one is doing to understand what you're doing and not doing and getting and not getting from the process of reading. To make one really important point is, when we read, we actually assume that we're digesting all of the meaning of what's being said in a passage automatically, simply because we've read it, right? And I want to separate the part of reading that involves reciting what's there versus actually understanding what's there, because those two things, obviously one is dependent on the other, but they're not the same things. It's really crucial. So the process of reading, really important. So some important things we're going to talk about connected with the process of reading, which is active reading. One cannot read unless one reads actively. And being active means two things. Number one, it's a process that doesn't just happen on its own. It's work. And sometimes it's even kind of painful. It's frustrating. It's challenging, especially when you read a challenging text. There's no doubt about that. I can tell you from experience, there are certain authors, which we'll talk about, that I read, and it was like banging your head against the wall, and when you stopped reading, it felt great because you were stopping to no longer bang your head. And normally that banging against the head of the wall, you're reading and you're not understanding, and it's challenging. So reading is not like watching a film. The film does the work for you into a profound degree, and it makes you incredibly passive and receptive, both in terms of the general technical process of what's happening, but also it makes you passive intellectually in terms of the ideas being communicated. All the readings I've given you, the readings on readings, are really designed to make you be engaged with the substance of what's being said, that it's relevant to you, that it matters, and to form an opinion. So active reading has two really key functions. Number one is simply the evaluation a judgment of the interpretation of what is being said. And then the second is an evaluation about what you think the value of what is being said. You can't evaluate it, you can't judge it, right, until you've made a reasonable attempt to figure out what is actually being said, right? And we see that active reading for Parks, and we'll talk about this in detail, really involves physically being active, or at least the physical activity of highlighting, of making marginal notes, of making questions, of making statements and evaluations. That physical activity, it actually helps you to engage up here cognitively with the text. And that is why, for example, I recommend or require that students must have the physical text in front of them as they read, because it allows you to engage the physical dimension of it, and the physically being able to mark it up is actually a reflection of what's going on up here. And by having the physical version, it's going to demand a more explicit and a more self-evident engagement with the text that doesn't otherwise happen, or the chances are less likely. Then the last thing we're going to talk about is this thing called hermeneutics, which just has to do with hermeneutics is really just a fancy word for the art of interpretation. And hermeneutics, number one, gets at the idea that interpretation is both an art and a science. There is some really strict logic that determines interpreting a text. The text only says what it says, right? Another text is the text that says something different. So you can't make one text say something other than what it says. Nonetheless, so therefore the text provides, you might even call it a matrix. It is a fixed structure of language and the arrangement of the language, the words that are used, the grammar that is used, where things are said, why a sentence is not here rather than there. You cannot change any of that. Therefore, your interpretation is really already bounded by what is actually in the text and the way it's in the text, the structure of it, the form of it, right, compared to what's not in the text. Nonetheless, obviously, after certain basic interpretations are made about key themes or key implications of statements, there is obviously room for our own personal experience to come to the text, which is absolutely important and relevant. And the fact that we don't agree or don't have the same opinions or we don't have the same takeaways about a text is really vital. But let's be clear, that starts saying something about us in reaction to the text that starts to go in a direction away from specifically what's there. So let's look at what we've got. First question I want to ask is, what are you actually doing when you read? And when I ask this question, I want to be Captain Obvious here. And I want to be as literal as possible to exactly what you are doing when you read. And the answer is not that complicated, but it needs to be broken. Reading needs to be broken down into its component parts to really understand what is going on, right? The first obvious thing you're doing before you can get... So when you think of reading, you think of, I'm getting the meaning of the text. I'm getting the idea communicated to me by an author. But when you start more basically, reading simply starts with looking at the words, right? I mean, stupid statement, if you're not looking at the words, you obviously can't get the author's meaning. And, the words are just black and white images on a page, text on a page, light and dark coming into your eyes, if you think in the most rudimentary way, right? And of course, what is reading really? It's taking those symbols on the page and translating them in your mind into something that's intelligible, right? In which they're obviously more than just black and white marks on a page. They have all kinds of important and interesting meanings that make us laugh, make us cry, make us think, what have you, right? So once we look at the words or scan our eyes across the word at the page or sentence at a certain rate, we recite those words in our head. The first translation we make when we read is not the translation to meaning, but it's the translation from a visual experience to an auditory one. And there's some really important elements about this. First, when we read, it's really an oral exercise, right? It's auditory, right? It involves either we're reading out loud or it involves our inner voice. And one of the really interesting studies that has been connected with the discipline of the phenomenology of reading, right, is that they have put people in labs and monitored their brains to see what happens when they actually read. There's an active process going on, right? And what they've discovered is that the auditory parts of the brain are responding even when you're reading silently. What does that mean? The auditory parts of the brain, in a nutshell, are the parts of the brain that get activated when you hear sounds, and more specifically, when you hear speech. They're the parts of the brain that are chunking away, analyzing that information that's coming in from the sensation of your ears, right? From auditory sensation, right? So what does that really mean? It means the voice in your head that you don't actually say with your mouth is, in a sense, a real voice that's being heard by you, right? So the process of reading is really the process, in a sense, of listening to your own voice, right? And this shouldn't sound so spectacular, right? I think essentially what you're doing is you've heard your voice enough as a grown human being that you're able to actually stimulate those parts of your brain that recreate the sensation of you hearing your own voice. Because, of course, when you hear it, it's your own voice, right? It's not someone else's, right? In the same way, a painter can envision a painting before they've made it in their mind. Or I think a really great example that I heard on the radio one time is that the musician Sting, who was with the Police, right? And then he went on to make like kind of mushy, 30-something, 40-something music for older people after he was the hardcore rock and roller. He said that he can compose a song completely in his head, and that people have photographic memory connected with vision. Well, he apparently has a photographic memory connected with sound, such that he can compose all the instruments and all the parts, I'm sure over time, but he can do it all in his head without having, you think of the typical musician in trying to hash out a song. They go into the studio and they sit at the piano and they hack around on it until they come up with a riff they like. Well, he can do that all in his head. And it's because of the stimulation of the auditory, simply self-stimulation, right? Beethoven, of course, I don't know exactly how old he was when he went deaf, but he obviously had been composing while he had the ability to hear. So at a certain point, Beethoven goes deaf, and yet he goes on to compose some of his most important, most famous symphonies without the ability to hear them, right? Because he knows what they sound like in his head. It's really fascinating. So here's the second component of the recitation of reading. And you see how granular we're being here. Reciting involves putting someone else's words into your own voice as if they were yours. There is one thing I want to stress, and that's stressed in the readings, particularly Houellebecq's Submission and Machiavelli's Letter to Vittori, is that reading is profoundly intimate. And I think it's why when you like a text, you really like it, and when you don't like it, you really don't like it. Because you don't really want to hear things from people that you're not crazy about their point of view. It's disruptive. And why is that? Because when you read, you're actually internalizing another person's word through this process of recitation and making it your own. Since they're not speaking to you, you have to speak their words to yourself. And in the process of doing that, there's this kind of process of internalizing them in your own head. You're taking a kind of ownership of them, right? Which I think is one reason why we shouldn't be so passive in our reading, because it's as if you're downloading someone else's thoughts. Why would you ever take someone's thoughts at face value and just kind of, cram them in the memory banks if they turn out to be, they have bad ideas, or they're just a poor understanding of the world, so on and so forth. So recitation, right? That's number 2, reciting the words in your head or aloud. Next one, and this is there's a big gap, right, between 2 and 3, and that's the gap that we've been talking about in the first video. The gap between words, on the one hand, the symbols and the sounds or the visual that goes with the symbol, and the meaning of them. In 2, we're just reciting and getting familiar with the symbols and what they are. But in 3, we're trying to make sense of what they mean. So we pause and reflect and interpret, which is to say we translate the meaning of those symbols that we've seen and sounded out into something that's intelligible to us. Now, here's the key factor. When you're reading a bit of text, a tweet, or newspaper, or what have you, that's really self-evident in its meaning and really clear and doesn't involve any higher level thinking, numbers 2 and numbers 3 happen virtually simultaneously, or at least we're not really fully cognizant or conscious of the distinction between the two. But the point is there's an important distinction between the two. And I'll give you a couple examples. Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind, or Phenomenology of Spirit, depending on how it's translated. Here's a book, when translated into English, almost every word in that text is really a common word of the English language that in its normal usage is not even lower than a no-brainer. It's all, it, I, subject, all kinds of words that are just really common and simple. But the way he uses them is rather mystifying. And this is a 400 to 500 page book, depending on the publisher. You could go through 200 pages of this book and have no clue what the hell he's talking about. And why is that? Because you're perfectly capable of reciting the words and you know their lexical or dictionary meaning, but you're not understanding particularly how he's using those words, and therefore there's a breakdown between numbers 2 and numbers 3, right? Okay. Another great example is Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, a book that is just, at first, for the average person, just utterly impenetrable. Utterly impenetrable. And again, using words that are not radically foreign to anyone. The words are used in a specialized way, but the specific words Kant uses in the Critique of Pure Reason are not unusual. They're words you're all familiar with from the English language. Okay, so we pause and reflect to interpret. And then number 4, we hope that in the process of that, I've even separated out 3 and 4 here, that when we pause and reflect, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to get to number 4, a clear meaning that makes sense. And this is really important to be cognizant. We talked about awareness of our own ignorance. And we become aware of our own ignorance when we pay attention to what we're doing, and we're aware precisely that we're not getting the full meaning of what's being said. So I ask you now to pick in your own mind your example of a text in which everything's, the words that are being used are not that unusual. There are no fancy specialized terms that sound like Greek to you. And yet, when you read, you really don't understand what's being said. That is in fact, an important experience. And, well, let's propose an answer. If you're not understanding it, why are you not understanding it? Because meaning, to a great extent, is use. And it means the author is using these words in a way that goes beyond the simple dictionary definitions, or they're using words that you're not familiar with. So therefore, what are we getting at? That the book is presenting a domain of experience that you are simply not familiar with for one reason or another, whether it's the words that are used being foreign to you or the way they're being used. One of the most fascinating things about Shakespeare, when we get to Shakespeare, is he has some unusual language, both because he has an expansive vocabulary and also because he's writing in the beginning of the 17th century. On the other hand, most of Shakespeare's language, in terms of the vocabulary, is not terribly foreign to anyone. The words will be familiar. However, he employs them in ways that are unexpected and alien to our moment. And in some instances, even probably alien to his 17th century context, like that they would have had to think a little bit what's being said here. Right? So in a challenging text, let's be clear, number 3 becomes much more apparent. You have to stop. You have to sip your coffee and think about what's being said. And if you think about the Bible and its stories, the parables of Jesus, for example, you realize that these are stories that you get the general lay of the land. You get the basic facts. You get the facts, man, what they're about. But then getting their meaning, it seems rather opaque at first. And part of their value is simply to force you to take the time to reflect and think about them. Now, let me tell you, not everything is written that way. The newspaper is not written that way. A great novel has really two levels. Like, in a great novel, you typically get the surface meaning fairly quickly. And a novel is not, a 400-page book, not meant to be suffered. You're not supposed to suffer while you read it. On the other hand, there's always a layer of meaning with a novel of a good novelist that you're not getting in that first read. Lastly, we get the meaning. But then the question becomes, what is the meaning that we're really getting? The meaning we're really getting is what another human being, in their mind, in their heart, in their soul, it's what they want to communicate to us, some anonymous reader who picks up their book for whatever reason, right? But they are speaking from a position of wanting to show you something that's inside of them, right? So when we read, what are we really doing? This is profound. We are not just getting words on a page. We're not just getting meaning, but we're communing with another human being. And this is part of the challenge. To what extent are you capable or willing to investing in getting to really understand another human being deeply? The beauty about books is that you're not just learning about you're learning about yourself, and you're learning about another human being. You're taking yourself outside yourself. And maybe it is in that moment that you can really start learning about who you are through actually learning about the world outside of you, right? There was a famous, I think a great line from a famous professor and a professor of philosophy at University of Chicago. He said, the modern young person, they want to express themselves. And he was like teaching, coming out of the late 60s, and they wanted to express themselves. And what they all discovered when they got to college is that there was nothing inside of them yet to express. They didn't know anything. Since they didn't know anything about the world, they didn't know anything about themselves, because you have to know something about yourself actually requires that you can compare yourself to an exterior object or another person or a character in a book by which you can differentiate yourself from another human being and start to see what you are by seeing also what you are not, and realizing that you have interests that maybe are very common or very aspects that are actually not common, but you wouldn't know how common they are or not common until you expose yourself. So this issue of knowing other minds is clearly on full display in Houellebecq's submission, where he talks about Huysmans, the author that he's writing a PhD on, is a friend he's in dialogue with. And he has a deeper, let's be clear, he has a deeper relationship with that author than he seems to have with any other human being who's actually in flesh and blood. Now that book, if you read the whole book, there's a certain caricature here, and he's being a little cute and a little sarcastic, and he's even kind of putting professors down in a certain way. They're all hermetic, and they sit around with their books, and they struggle to socially adapt to other human beings. But there is a kernel of truth in what he's saying, and you see it again in Machiavelli. Machiavelli wants to have a dialogue with the authors of the ancient world. And number one, he believes there is a common human nature and a common human experience, which allows him to traverse his Renaissance. He's living in the 16th century Italy, and he is actually, you could say, I was just watching Bill and Ted trailer for some reason. He's traveling through time through Bill and Ted, but instead of having the telephone booth, he's got the book that transports him to another place. And he believes that he can actually have a dialogue with these people. And I think, what are they getting at? And it's something that Harold Bloom gets at. He says, you cannot possibly know enough people well enough in ordinary life, and therefore you turn to books, right? And I think there's some important things here. Number one, our life very often is very pedestrian. We have a lot of work-a-day concerns. Pay the bills, 9 to 5, pay the man, work to be able to pay the man. We've got a lot of practical concerns. But we have a deep need to connect with other human beings. So the practical concerns intervene and make that challenging, number one. Number two, our lives are boring. We're boring. We're not that interesting. A book is where a human being, in all its dimensions, who's very interesting, can reveal themselves. And then again, our friends and acquaintances are absolutely central, but we are not exceptional very often, and the people we're around are not terribly exceptional, if we can say so ourselves. And it's often in books where you can find the great minds. There's one other important aspect of this knowing the other minds and why books are so essential. In real life, because we live in practical circumstances, we got to get by, we got to conform. But we really have a profound need to know the truth about what's going on in other people's lives, right? We have things that we can't publicly talk about with other people, and they can't talk about with us, but we'd really like to be able to have that conversation. Profoundly important. So some people go off to the therapist, right? And that's one version of it. And you always notice that the therapist is not your friend, in the sense that they don't treat you like a friend, but also once you step out of that office, they're not there for you in the rest of your private life. The book, however, is a place where you can read about those details, I don't know, salacious, private, whatever they happen to be, from the comfort of your, the comfort of your bedroom, or the comfort of your comfy chair, without the threat of those facts disrupting the practical demands of life. An author can put their intimate thoughts down and have a distance, right? I mean, this conversation had in books is something like the conversation, you bump into the stranger on the train and you tell them things about yourself that you would never tell anybody else. And why is that? Because, here's the next stop, New York City. You're going to get off. You're never going to see that person again. So they take that truth off with them, and it never comes back to haunt you in terms of the dynamics of your own life. Rousseau writes the Confessions, 18th century Frenchman, Swiss, really. He'd be offended if I called him a Frenchman. But the goal of that book, the Confessions, was to put to strip himself bare psychologically, psychological nudity, right? To put it all out there. And of course the book wasn't released, the whole book wasn't released until after his death. And therefore he was able to talk about sensitive issues that he couldn't have just talked about regularly during life. And those kind of facts are the ones we really yearn for. Because human beings present an image and can conceal their inner life, we really need to see that inner life to get guidance. And just there's a pleasure and there's a seductive quality to wanting to know about what you typically don't have access to from most other people. So before we get to the technical procedures of highlighting and that really reflect the evidence of critical or analytical or active reading, let's just think generally about what it actually involves cognitively. So critical reading or active reading is one that involves reflecting on what you have read. It's the process of discerning the thought behind the text. And it almost always involves rereading in order to identify patterns, key facts, values, assumptions, language, any number of things you might be looking for. And with number 3, you notice that the reader is looking for something. That one of the key things we're going to see in a moment is that active reading involves preemptively developing a series of things you're already looking for in the text, that gives you a mission to try to find them, right? And it is rarely ever the case that you fully grasp a text the first time. So reading, as Nabokov says, all reading is in fact rereading, right? In this process, we're trying to analyze specifically what's in the text and determine what is really there. But of course, with number 4, we're also bringing our own outside knowledge. The text doesn't mean anything until we bring our own experiences, our own lives to bear. And I mean this in two senses. In a really logical sense, that we know what life is like. We know what this world is like. We know that it functions on the laws of thermodynamics and things of that sort. We know the mechanics of life. So therefore, when we read, we understand what's being said, and all that experience is crucial in reconstructing the meaning. But then, of course, we also have a much more fine-grained experience that is unique to us, and we're bringing our particular point of view to the text, right? And that's also something to be really aware of, because it's very easy to see what you want to see in a text or a bit of writing because of your natural predispositions. And so being aware of the experience you bring to bear on a text is not simply a matter of finding your own interest in the text, but also becoming aware when your own interests are not being validated or your own point of view is not being validated. Of course, we all know what that's called today. It's called confirmation bias. So, for example, when you read a bit of news and it tells you exactly what you want to hear, you should actually be skeptical rather than feeling good about yourself, because the world doesn't exist to tell you, to yield events that perfectly fit the narrative in your mind of what you'd like it to be. That's just not the way the world works. And you also should probably be skeptical of the media source where you're getting that, when you're hearing the partisan point of view that perfectly conforms to your own biases, right? In fact, I just heard a survey that about 65% of Americans now feel very skeptical about what the media says, and that they think that is actually a very healthy thing to be. And if we talked about it in the context of the functioning of our democracy, I would say absolutely that skepticism should be the order of the day when it comes to, notice the language, consuming media. We shouldn't be consuming media, we should be interrogating media to see if it really lines up with the facts of things, and look for ruptures, look for omissions, look for contradictions, and so on and so forth. And I think when Americans say they're skeptical about the news, I don't necessarily think they believe that they're being cynically duped by the media, although they may be, right? But rather that there is no reason for us to just accept at face value what we're told, right? Because where is the burden of truth? The burden of truth is not on the teller, it's on the receiver. This is actually a really crucial point that Plato makes in his Republic. He says there's two types of lies. We'll talk about this again when we get to Plato. He says there's the lie in speech, meaning the lie in words, and then there's the lie in the soul. And the lie in speech is when someone tells you a lie. They literally speak a lie. But the lie in the soul is when you accept those words as true, and you've displaced the authority of your own judgment for truth and correctness on the other person simply because they're telling you something. The lie in the soul is that you've accepted the lie in speech uncritically, or without any of your own evaluation or any sense that you are responsible as a gatekeeper for the truth, right? That's what I think people are saying when the majority of the country is now skeptical with the media. The burden is on us. You cannot let a book or the media do your thinking for you, because let me tell you, they will do it for you. And we'll look at a couple quotes in a second. So by bringing our own experience, ultimately it culminates in three things: analysis, inference, and judgment, right? Analysis has to do with breaking things down into component parts to understand them. These are three types of understanding, right? Inference has to do with drawing conclusions that are not explicitly stated in this text, but they provide the predicate for reaching a conclusion that while the evidence isn't strictly in the text, there is evidence to support the inference being made. And then the last one is judgment. What do you think is being said, or an evaluative judgment? Once you understand what is said, do you agree with it? Do you think it's good? Do you think it's bad? How would you characterize it? And Harold Bloom really hammers this home, that reading is really about cultivating the ability to have your own mind. Our democracy, and this really ties in the basic political structure of our society, our democracy demands, if it is to be successful, people who take responsibility for themselves in a variety of ways. And the primary way we always think of it is economically. But in terms of the political dimension of our life, judging the events that happen and the decisions of politicians and judging their character, it really demands that we have our own minds and think for ourselves, rather than just following an ideology that we've been given, and that so on. And Bloom sees reading as one of the fundamental tools that allows us to judge. And of course, it ultimately has consequences that go beyond the political to the personal. To judge what you want from your life, to judge the events of your life, the value, the meaning, the significance. He says it matters, should be matters, if individuals are to retain, notice this word, any capacity, right? Meaning like we're at zero without it. To retain any capacity to form their own judgments and opinions, which means to form your own mind. Have your own mind. Don't be a jarhead, or what is it, an NPC, right? That mindlessly follows. If we have any ability to judge and form opinions, that they continue to read for themselves. So this is the problem of a course like this. You're reading for me, you're reading for the course, you're reading for a grade. No, you're reading for yourself to cultivate your own mind, because everyone is trying to bootstrap themselves up to have their own genuine point of view. And not for the sake of, arbitrary individuality or contrariness, but because you are you and no one else is you, and you're in the situation you're in, and therefore the only answers for your life must come from you. It's a very kind of solipsistic position, but it's true. So how they read, well or badly, what they read cannot depend wholly on themselves, but why they read must be for and in their own interest. And I think developing your own mind is absolutely in your own interest. It's a central function of a liberal education. And what do we say a liberal education is really all about? It's about making you a complete and full human being, developing all those faculties or capacities you have as a human being in body and soul, reason and emotions, the totality of what you are. The vocation, finance, accounting, all these things, they cultivate what you're good at, right? But they only, and what you like, but they only cultivate a narrow range of things. And as a human being, but also as a citizen, it really demands that you have a breadth of identity, that you've developed more than just the vocation that you've chosen, right? Which is really saying developing all of you. Okay. Part of active or critical reading, and I'm kind of just using those words interchangeably, is coming to the text with questions. Part of the logic of my reading response questions is that you read them before you have read the text, so that you bring those questions to bear and interrogate the text in order to discern what's there in an active way. right? So any reader, you must come to the text with questions, even if it's as simple as, what does this mean? Or what does the author really want to tell me, right? And this is a skill that must be developed if you're going to really understand what other people are saying and take it critically and be able to distinguish your own point of view from what they're saying, right? These questions, if you keep them in the front of your mind long enough, become kind of second nature. So you start reading and you just anticipate these issues as they come along if you do enough reading. And also if you read enough different types of things, whether it's, fiction, nonfiction, the novel versus a poem, the newspaper versus a blog, the newspaper versus a Twitter account, and what have you. So what type of text is it, right? What is the form of the text? Is it a novel, magazine, newspaper, blog, and so on and so forth? Why is that important? Because it's going to have a different, depending on what type of text it is, it's going to have a different style. It's going to have a different format, It's going to have a different function, right? It's going to have a different theme. It's going to have a different concern, right? It's going to have a different length in which meaning is going to be more or less compressed, right? And therefore, you're going to have to anticipate all those different features in advance, right? So all these formats have different styles. If you think about it, for example, they have different language, they have different grammar. If you think of the newspaper, for example, the newspaper expects that you have a college education. They expect, for example, that when you read articles on politics, that you know the rudiments of the American government and the rudiments of its history, right? They're going to use SAT words that they're going to expect you to know, or they're going to use words coming from American government and the history of American government that they're going to expect that you know, right? And if you don't know them, you're going to be out to sea, number one. Number two, the goal of the newspaper is to write in a kind of clear and distinct way to communicate information. There is an efficiency. If you read, I think a great example is the front page of the Wall Street Journal, more so than the New York Times. The Wall Street Journal writes with a concision. They write to the point. They write with tremendous clarity. They explain complex things with great simplicity. And it's not that they're being simplistic. It's that they're taking complicated realities and giving it to you in the clearest way possible because, well, for the most part, they don't want you to misconstrue what's being said. They want you to understand clearly what they're talking about. So there is a grammar. For example, at the New York Times, there is a book of grammar that the writers at the New York Times get that they must adhere to for the most part, particularly if you're talking about the news section rather than the opinion section. What is the purpose of the text? Is it to entertain, to inform, to educate, to persuade, to provoke, right? Being cognizant of why the author is writing is going to help you key in to how you understand it. Who is it intended for, right? When you pick up Hegel's Phenomenology, it's intended for an audience that's conversant in Western history, that's conversant in the history of philosophy. And if you don't have a whole set of basic frameworks for understanding, this book is just going to be utterly impenetrable to you. So books expect and anticipate a certain reader, and by which I mean a reader that has a certain framework of experience and understanding. Why do you not understand the economics textbook if you've never picked up an economics? It's because you don't have the framework of understanding. Is the text fiction or nonfiction? This is really crucial because when we read nonfiction, we really believe that what's being said happened out in the world. When we read fiction, we're not expecting what's being said to be a replication or representation of anything in the world. However, it gets complicated. you could make an argument with the slippage between words in the world or language in the world, that all writing, this is an overstatement, and in the full-blown statement I would never agree with it, because I believe language can represent the world with great fidelity. But there is a fine-grained level at which, in a sense, all language, all writing is a bit fictitious, because it's so prone to being misunderstood, and therefore, if you're not understanding it correctly, it's kind of fiction. It's not what they're really saying. It's not the world they're really articulating. Of course, the newspaper has devised a whole series of ways to misrepresent things in really subtle ways without explicitly lying ever, but by the way they arrange the material and the facts, the information they present. They can really change your impression of what's going on in the world, the nonfiction reality, by the way they present it to you, right? And a keen, careful reader of the newspaper, and it requires a lot of newspaper reading, you start to see the way in which they're trying to manipulate your understanding of the world by how they arrange the writing, and also, of course, by also seeing other sources that represent the world differently, talking about the same topics. Who is the author, right? So, very often we expect that the biography of the author profoundly informs what's being said. And of course, there's two ways in which that could be taken. That literally what's being described is biographical, or more generally that obviously their own experiences in a certain time and place, living a certain life, frame what they talk about in their writing and how they understand it, right? What's interesting about our texts that we read in this class is that it's not until the first couple major texts we're going to read are really collective works. They're indicative of and they come from really a whole culture rather than one decisive author who is expressing distinctly their point of view. Obvious question: what's the main point? What is this all about? You have to ask yourself. Writing takes tremendous time and energy, and it's tedious and it's complicated. And to write well, you have to read a tremendous amount, and therefore, if they're spending the time to write this and craft a novel, what are they really trying to tell you? What do they want to communicate? Because let's be clear, despite the fact that it's in the dress, the garb of, say, a novel, that author wants to tell you something about life that they think is important. What conclusions does the author reach? So on and so forth. Okay, so how do we really affect or achieve active or critical reading? Well, I'll tell you, the only real proof of it is with, as Tim Parks says, you must read with a pen in your hand. He says not on the table, but in your hand. You read the text through, there's different ways to think of it. I find when I read that highlighting and marginal notes can be really distracting from the flow of reading. On the other hand, if I'm doing that without thinking about it, it means I'm having a lot of reactions. I'm having thoughts. My mind is firing. Things are happening. I'm not just a zombie there, No, I'm having a reaction. I'm having that dialogue that Machiavelli, that dialogue is very real. The text says something to you, and you say something back to it. The problem is, once you say something back to it, it doesn't speak to you again, right? And Machiavelli sits there, in his courtly garment and at his table, anticipating the responses to his questions that he earnestly wants answered, but of course he can only speculate. And I think when he says that, he means it very seriously. I think he's trying to imagine, quite literally, what those thinkers that he loved and thought were profoundly important, what they would say about his take on his interpretation of their own thoughts. So highlight. So why do you highlight? You highlight key phrases you do not understand, right? Really crucial. You come across a word you don't know the meaning of, look it up. Look it up. You got a computer right there. Just do it, right? Passages you don't understand, that's just as important as highlighting passages you do understand. Because if, I always find that students have a good knack for discerning what passages in a text are important, but they're not always there in terms of understanding what they mean, which is two different things. You have an intuition that they're important, but you don't know what it is. That's a really crucial moment, because you're probably right. Passages that seem important, meaningful, interesting, passages that you react to, right? Obviously. Passages that seem to capture the main point. Marginal notes. What are they really? They are your reactions and evidence of your understanding, evidence of your observations, your agreements and disagreements, and your random related thoughts. So marginal notes span the gamut from, interpretations to evaluations, to calling the text, calling to mind thoughts that you wouldn't otherwise have had if you hadn't read it. And let me tell you, some of those are the most important thoughts that can be generated. Ask yourself things like, what is the main theme? What is the main point? What is the meaning and purpose of each paragraph? Right? This is really important. I had a professor in graduate school ask one of the most difficult questions I've seen a class asked. We would read a very short bit of writing, maybe a page or two long, and we'd read the first paragraph aloud. And then she would say this. She would not say, what does this paragraph mean? She would say, what is the purpose of this paragraph? Meaning, why did the author write this paragraph? What were they trying to get at? What were they trying to communicate? And let me tell you, that is a very difficult question. And this is a question you shouldn't just be asking in your reading, but obviously in your writing. Each thing, the whole text, but each paragraph you write should have a purpose. And once you've discerned what that purpose is, you can edit it and shape it really strongly, because you know what should be in there and what shouldn't be in there. But Tim Parks says, to sum it all up here, read with a pen in your hands, not beside you on the table, but actually in your hand, ready, armed. Now, I won't say it here, but, the weapons for readers, what really is the weapon? Obviously, on one hand, it's the pen. And notice that he has this military or martial metaphor here, that you are going to war with the text. You are trying to wrestle with it. You are confronting it. You're attacking it. You're interrogating it, right? And that helps initiate, it's violent, it initiates the activity, but it's also, he almost cultivates a kind of aggressive attitude with the text. And why? Because for the mindless, passive acceptance of other people's representations of the world can only enchain us and hamper our personal growth, hamper the possibility of positive action. Now, this is most obvious with the media. Our passive receptance, based on the authority of the media being the media, we just accept what they say about the world, right? But this is true of any text. And there's a notable difference between Tim Parks and Harold Bloom. Harold Bloom represents a side of active reading that's involved in greater reverence and respect for the author's point of view, and Tim Parks is more concerned about more explicitly cultivating your own point of view and being more aggressive with the author's point of view, right? And I think a balance needs to be struck here. What's the point of being aggressive toward the author if you're not really understanding them in the first place? We have to try to respectfully grasp what you think they are trying to tell you before you determine the value or validity of it, right? But ultimately, the key point is, he says, it enchains. If we do not read actively and develop our own mind, we are enchained by the thoughts of others that are maybe not fit for us because we're individuals. We're who we are, right? Now, Tim Parks is he's a professor of Italian, and he's versed in Italian history and also Machiavelli. And I really wonder whether he hasn't appropriated this idea from Machiavelli, who is a political philosopher and also a playwright and essayist and so on. But, Machiavelli seems to use this metaphor of war in relationship to judgment and understanding, right? And he has a famous idea coming from his book called The Prince, which was a book that told princes how they were supposed to be good, successful princes in a nutshell, right? And he says princes, when they go to war, they should always do it with their own arms, right? Because you can trust your own arms more than you can trust mercenaries. People are just fight for money. So when there's no money, they don't care about the war anymore, right? He says you have to fight with your own arms, right? Weapons for readers. Arms are weapons, right? So I think what Machiavelli, there's a double entendre here. There's another meaning that in understanding the world, in order to succeed, one must rely on one's own arms. And what is one's own arms? It's this. It's your own brain. Don't let other people determine what the knowledge is or what the truth is. You determine it for yourself. And this becomes explicit later on in the text, where Machiavelli, he repeats a passage that's actually original from Hesiod, and then it's repeated by Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics. He talks about secretaries for princes, and secretaries were literally people who kept secrets for the prince. And they were kind of like understood as the power behind the throne. They were the real thinkers, and the prince is just the kind of front man, kind of like Joe Biden today. Everybody, even people on the left, think Joe is a kind of a puppet for people in the shadows behind him who are doing the real thinking. But he's the guy who's on stage, and the real thinkers are concealed somewhere. And Machiavelli says this, and since there are three kinds of brains, one that understands by itself, another that understands and it discerns only what others understand, and the third that understands neither by itself nor through others, it understands nothing. He says the first is most excellent, the second just excellent, and the third positively useless, right? The most excellent brain is the one that has its own mind, that understands and discerns on its own without other people assisting it, right? Okay. People who know their own minds. So now we are rounding third and heading home here. Okay, so now we're going to talk about something called hermeneutics, and a concept in hermeneutics called the hermeneutic circle. And these are very fancy words, but I think when we understand, we look at what they are, break them down, we'll realize not that complicated. First, hermeneutics is the art, not science, of interpretation. And this word historically used to be connected with the interpretation of religious texts, and which are understood as inspired text, literally the word or the voice of God. So hermeneutics derives from the word hermenei, which in turn comes from the mythic god Hermes. If you know anything about Hermes in ancient Greek mythology, he is the terrestrial deity that became a messenger or intercessor, a go-between between gods and men, right? So he communicated messages from the gods, say Zeus up on Mount Olympus, down to the people in ancient Greece, along the Aegean and in the various city-states. And the point is this: Hermes was capable of making divine thought incarnate, in tangible form, and intelligible to human beings by translating the divine spirit of the gods from the infinite to the finite, from the eternal realm into the particular, from the heavenly realm into our human realm. So the idea was that gods are beings that are beyond time and space. They're infinite. They're not finite. They are beings that are beyond our embodied existence, right? Therefore, their language is some other extraterrestrial, supernatural language that we couldn't understand on our own. So what does Hermes do? He takes the language, the divine language of the gods, and materializes it incarnate, just like Jesus is God incarnate, made flesh in the world. The Bible is God made flesh in the world, literally. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. The Bible and God are one, says the first lines of the Gospel of John, right? So Hermes was the one who could translate. So what is hermeneutics? It's that art of interpretation that translates prophetic or inspired or the speech of God coming through various conduits like Moses, translating that into something we can understand. And I'll give you a really clear example. In ancient Athens, there was what's called the oracle at Delphi. An oracle is a being that foresees the future because they're like a prophet or a mouthpiece for the gods. And they speak, the gods speak through them, or like a medium, and we hear it. And so in ancient Greece, people would go to the oracle of Delphi to ask about important events that were upcoming and ask advice about the future so that they could do the right things, right? You can imagine today, like, someone going to their stockbroker and asking about, like, what stock to invest in, right? The problem is the oracle spoke in riddles. The oracle did not speak clearly. And I'll give you one simple example. The king of Lydia, Croesus, goes to the oracle of Delphi to ask whether he should go to war against the Persians, right? The Persians have a great empire. Croesus has a great empire. And the oracle of Delphi says, if you go to war, a great empire will fall. If you go to war, a great empire will fall. So Croesus says, hey, that's great. If I go to war, the Persian Empire will fall. So he goes to war, and of course, his own empire falls, right? Because the oracle was not clear. So what is hermeneutics? It's interpreting that speech. In time, so originally, we should say hermeneutics referred to what I'm talking about here. Translating into the human meaning the implication of divine oracles. But it's come to be applied to prophetic and human speech alike. We've talked about Spinoza in the late 19th century, and later in late 19th century German scholarship. Revealed speech, or divine speech, inspired speech, was reduced and collapsed to just historical or literary speech. It's why we teach the Bible in a class of literature. The implication of Hermes' vocation on the discipline suggests that the meaning of all utterances is somehow fundamentally elusive and in need of illumination, right? So what has hermeneutics come to mean today in kind of the literary academic discipline? It is the art or science of understanding the thought that sits behind the text, communicated on the surface through its language from the author to the reader. The language, the symbols, is literally the coin of the realm that's transmitted from the past to us in the present, and we have to unpack it to glean its meaning. We have to interpret it, which is to say, to make intelligible the thought, which is really what? The mental world of the author, make that intelligible to the reader. So hermeneutics has this strong implication of a kind of communion between two human beings and between that of the author and that of the reader. And it acknowledges that really two worlds collide, divided by time, experience, and language in the process of reading and interpreting the text. This is exactly what this class is all about. So from the point of view of hermeneutics, it stresses that interpretation is the process of making these two worlds aligning by discovering the inner reality, the hidden meaning behind the language of the text and making it intelligible to the reader. So speaking about these two worlds aligning, it's the world of the reader and the world of the author. and that as we understand them, these two realities converge in a kind of mutual harmony. And I'll see what that means literally in just a moment. Pardon me here. Okay, so before we conclude with that discussion of the kind of alignment of those two worlds of the reader and the author, I want to talk about the concept of the hermeneutic circle. This is really crucial. Hermeneutic circle just means this, that the meaning of a text consists in its circular relationship between the parts and the whole in the parts, right? Meaning emerges through structure, right? There's two elements to meaning. There's one that has to do with the relationship between the words on the page and their reference, the things they point to in the concrete world. But then there is meaning also that is generated not between words and things, but words and other words. For example, right, I could understand the meaning of words not by referring to the world, but by referring to the dictionary and just understanding those words. But then ultimately those words would have to have some intelligible meaning in relationship to our experiences. But part-to-part relationships. How is the first sentence of the text connected with the last sentence? How's the first paragraph connected with the last? How's the first chapter connected with the chapter in the middle of the book? How many of you really even think of those types of relationships? The first problem you're going to think of is, well, oh my God, how can I even think in those terms? That's really challenging. And the answer is you're right. And that's why all reading is rereading. But the hermeneutic circle suggests the way in which meaning is generated through the structure of a text, through the relationship of part to part, part to whole, whole to part, and so on and so forth. Then let's just think about what are the parts a text can be broken down into, right? And there's a whole variety of them, right? Starting with the title and then going with the body of the text and breaking the body down into chapters. Let's say we're reading a novel, and breaking the chapter down into paragraphs, paragraphs down into sentence, and sentence down into phrases, and then the phrases into words, right? And so you think of what is like the unit of meaning of a text. Well, it starts with words and phrases, and then sentences, and then paragraphs. I mean, what is a sentence typically understood as? One complete coherent thought, right? And what is a paragraph? It's a series of thoughts that are all built around likely a common theme or a common issue, an axis which they all rotate around. So one important thing here is the relationship between a title and a text, right? It's a really basic thing, but it's really crucial, right? And we'll come back to that in just a second. Now this starts to capture all the structural relationships within a hermeneutic circle. There's a relationship between a word in a phrase and the phrase itself, between a phrase and a sentence, between a sentence and the paragraph itself. So let's just take the sentence and the paragraph. It's this. You can't really understand the full meaning of the sentence unless you've understood it within the context of the paragraph, because the paragraph fleshes out the full dimensions and all the ramifications of the meaning of that sentence. So the part is the sentence and the whole is the paragraph, and you can't understand either until you have them in relationship to one another. So if you want to understand a paragraph, you have to understand it in context of a whole text, right? You could think of it in these terms. Oeuvre means a whole body of work of an author. Let's say you want to understand the meaning of a certain novel. You say, I will be, or the speech of a politician. I can't understand the full implications of that speech until I've read every speech that politician has given, and then I can start to see how it fits within the general characteristics that they establish in all their speeches, or how it deviates from them. And it starts giving me an insight through the comparison, starts giving me an insight into the significance of it. So one of the important relations, so here we're looking at the hermeneutic circle connected with a book, right? The book includes the chapters include all the paragraphs, the sentences, words, and, from big to small. And then, of course, there's a title affixed to the book. The title is really crucial, actually. It establishes that part-to-whole relationship. So there's a title that becomes a handle, a kind of cognitive grasp handle for the whole text. The title informs the body, and the body informs the title, right? The two go together. You can't just read a title, look up in the dictionary the meaning of those words, and capture the meaning of the title, right? The title is a handle which categorizes the text and orients the reader. It frames their understanding. It frames their expectations on what they find in it. Interestingly, Yale scholars said this, and I think it's really valuable. The title is the first interpretation of the text, and what's great about it is it's done by the author rather than, some scholar or what have you, right? So if you think about girl, right, or you think about mending wall, you could probably imagine a lot of titles for those two texts that would be perfectly logical with the substance of what's found in them. The point is, those authors are directing us to specific elements of those texts to frame our understanding and to highlight what they see as the most crucial thing, right? Girl. I would bet that you could also have girl titled mother, right? Or you could have it titled something very different, right? Okay. Here. So the hermeneutic circle suggests that meaning is generated only when we understand the relationship of a part of the text to the whole. Well, there's an obvious problem here. The first time you read a text, when you read the first sentence of a text, you haven't read the whole thing. So what's the conclusion you need to reach? I can't possibly know what this first sentence fully means and all its implications until I've read the whole text. And it's a closed circle. The circle going from beginning, right, to end. Simple, it's really as simple as that. So, but the problem of reading is, if meaning comes from the relationship to the whole, is that we can't possibly have in our minds the whole of the text all the time, right? Because what do we do when we read? We scan let's just say a sentence at a time. So the only thing that's really in the forefront of our minds is that one sentence. And what is the hermeneutic circle suggesting? That we have to have meaning comes from understanding the relationship of that sentence to everything that comes both before it and after, or aft, fore and aft, right? Boat metaphors, right? But here's the thing. When you're reading a sentence on page 200 in a book, it's making references to page 1 or page 2, but it's also foreshadowing the end to come. And you can only it's the same with a movie. I don't understand why this scene is in there the first time I watch. I don't understand how it relates to the rest of the film. So you watch the film 100 times, and you start to understand how it sits. And the challenge of reading or watching a film is the same thing. At any given moment, you're only fixated on that specific island within the rest of the film or the rest of the book. But really, all reading must be rereading, in that the second time you read, when you read that opening paragraph of the novel, you understand how it's anticipating the entire text. So it's very common with really good novels, it's not true of all of them, that in the first paragraph of a novel, the whole novel is sitting right there. But the first time you read the book, you just don't know it, because you don't see how the way in which it's a microcosm of the entire text. So when we look at Genesis, the first 3 chapters of Genesis are really a microcosm for the entire text. And what happens there is going to unfold, and the structure that's there is going to unfold over and over and over again. And you see that part, really, the way it plays into the whole. So you give an example, here of just Genesis. We'll talk about this more. Establishes cycles of birth. Genesis means the beginning or the birth of everything, both the cosmos, the earth, and mankind. And picking the fruit brings about the fall. So what does it establish? It establishes kind of like a sine curve, almost like the economy. It goes up, cycles, and down, up and down, right? And everything that's in Genesis is already foreshadowing the cyclical nature of the events that go from the Old Testament right to the New Testament, from the birth to the life to the death of Christ, is in many ways a recapitulation of the life cycle that's established in Genesis and Noah. So we've kind of established this now, but here's the beginning of the text. And Nabokov says all reading is rereading, because one can't grasp this whole until one has read the whole thing. And I'll come back to this example of Hegel's Phenomenology. When you read the preface, which is before the introduction, the preface is utterly impenetrable. And it's really not until you read the whole book to the end, and then come back and read the preface, does the preface even start to make sense. Very interesting. And what do you discover historically? That Hegel wrote the preface last, after he had the whole train of thought of the whole text in his mind, held in his mind. And then really the preface, in a way, is like a condensation of 400 pages of writing, very dense writing, into maybe 15 pages. So I want to shift away from the hermeneutic circle and back to this basic issue that hermeneutics involves. It's the art of interpretation. It's the art of discerning the thought behind the words. But really, in discerning the thought, you have to keep in mind, you're discerning the thought of another human being from, can we say, another dimension with a different body of experience, right? With a different set of words at their disposal, or words that they use in a slightly different way than you do because of their application of those words to their unique experience, their view on the world, right? So how do we generate, what did Parks say? He said that a book or a text is a representation of the world. And he said, don't take those representations at face value. Interrogate them, question them, bring them before the tribunal of your own judgment, right? So let's go back into the mechanics of how this works. We all have our own distinct path through the world, right? We all have words in common, but because of our distinct path, we haven't applied those same words in the same way to the world, number one. Number two, we've also carved a different path through the world in terms of our exposure to language. I read the books that I read, you read the things that you read, you hear the things that you hear, I hear the things that I hear. We're all using the same counters, the same coins, the same currency, that's the language, but we're using it in slightly different contexts that has implications for how we understand all the connotations of those words. Then, of course, I'm a professor of this, you study that. We have different specialized terms that we're familiar with that either you know or you don't know. It's for all these reasons that words are tokens of representation to try to capture the world, and therefore they're a rough equivalent to our own experiences. For one of the obvious reasons is they are symbols that only crudely capture and have a limited fidelity to what it's like to be in the world, right? Because we translate this thing here into this stuff over here, this thoughts that come in the medium of language. And therefore there's a challenge in communication, and all communication is a form of miscommunication, meaning there's a baseline of understanding in which we do understand each other, but it's exactly that we understand each other that we also become aware of the discrepancies between our thoughts with one another. And that has to do with what we've been talking about, a divergence in our own experiences, right? This is, I'm stressing the difference here. It's not insurmountable. The point is to be aware of the discrepancies, to be aware of where one is ignorant, so that one then can be open to what the other person or the text is really saying, rather than assuming. Because let's go back to the main thing. We assume we know. We're arrogant when we think we understand. We need to be aware of our own ignorance. We need to be aware that the other person is coming from a different point of view, and that they're using words in a different way. They're using words we're not familiar with. It's not, if we can be aware of that, then we can say, explain what you mean. And then we can say, oh, I do get it. I do understand exactly what, I haven't done that myself, but I know exactly what you're talking about. So this little chart here really visualizes what's happening. So here we have on the left a text and the author's understanding of it. When the author writes a text, the meaning is transparent for the most part. I mean, there are levels of meaning, of course, but they get it. They wrote it. And they wrote it from their own experience, so it's their experience. It reflects their experience, so there's a transparency of the meaning of it. And that text is part of their total experience of life and also language. See, what shapes our use of language is, number one, our experiences, but our experiences also include the experience of language itself, right? And there's a total body of, say, the English language, and each of us inhabits like a certain corner or a certain niche of that language, in which there's a lot of overlap, right? But there's also divergence, right? The overlap is the place where we understand, and the divergence is the place where we don't, we're going to have problems of understanding. And then, of course, that experience is situated in a certain, what I'm calling a unique historical milieu. That's just like a certain epoch, a certain time and place with a certain worldview. So what happens when we read? The text, it's going through, it's like beam me up, Scotty. It's being transferred like the teleporter in Star Trek. That's not what it's called. I can't believe I can't remember it. I'm such a bad Star Trek fan. It's being transferred from one time and place to another, right? When we read it, right? And of course, we exist within a unique time and place with our own language and so on and so forth. So here we are with the same text, the author to the reader. And in a sense, the text is not the same because we're grasping it from our point of view. And of course, our goal would be to try to really understand it the way they would. What's the point of reading the text if it's just whatever? If it's just a Rorschach test, right? I am preaching fidelity. Despite the acknowledgement of difference, I'm teaching the attempt at a faithful reading of a text. Okay. So then, you notice here, we've got the author and the reader and their experience of language, right? So there's going to be overlap, including the texts that they hold in common, but there's also going to be divergences, and I've kind of just said this, but in the areas that we hold in common of shared experience and language, there's going to be understanding. But where we're unique, there's going to be a breakdown of understanding. Visualizing this allows you to see it really clearly. So I'll just conclude with this. This is not a literary exercise. This is not simply something that's academic. This has real-world and profound consequences. Trying to understand an author in relationship to how they understood their text, right? And I'll give you the most the example that has the most immediate impact on our own lives and our nation as individuals and citizens and so on, and that is the Constitution. The Constitution, written in 1787, right, is still the document used today, that it provides the supreme law of the land, and that every constitutional office holder takes an oath to the Constitution. And to take an oath to the Constitution is to take an oath to the language of it and to its meaning, right? And in the early 20th century, there emerged a school of thought that times change, right? So we move from one historical moment to another historical moment. We progress from an older past into a bright, illuminated future. And the idea was that with the with the change in time, the passage of time, the meaning of the Constitution not only would change, but should change. It should not be a fixed document understood as the original founders understood it, but it should be what was called a living document or a living constitution, whose meaning would evolve with the change of time, the times, right? In the second half of the 20th century, there's been a big pushback, and this philosophy of reading has profound implications for the first the interpretation of the Constitution, but then how our government functions and what our society is and what we should expect from our society and what we should expect from our government. In the second half of the 20th century, there was a school called originalism that came along that was determined to understand the Constitution as the founders had understood it. And the first question I ask, is that possible? And the answer is, well, it's obviously a great challenge because you're you and they're them, not just as an individual, but living in the 21st century in the world we live in. And then the second question becomes, if we're to take this idea seriously of understanding an author as they understand themselves, if we took it seriously, how would we even attempt to do it? Well, the answer is we'd have to read and be conversant with the things they read, because that provides the body of language which they use to write the Constitution and explain it. We would have to understand the historical circumstances under which they were operating, how the key terms of the Constitution, how those words were used in that day. And the answer is, can it be done? Well, actually, yes. With a pretty great fidelity, there is enough of a historical record, for example, to go back to their moment, and when they use a certain bit of language, to understand the specific connotations it has. Because, for example, we have the records of the Constitutional Convention, or we have the Federalist Papers, which were written by people involved in crafting the Constitution, who, the point of the Federalist Papers is they actually explained, this is how we understand the Constitution and its functioning and how it's supposed to function, and how it relates to, American life. So, this issue of interpretation and understanding an author has profound implications. You might think of, for example, now, different political persuasions in our country are the result of differing interpretive philosophies to the Constitution. Or you could think of the diverse array of Christian sects, whether it's Catholic, Protestant, Lutheran, Episcopal, so on and so forth, have to do with different interpretive understandings of the Bible, right? And why I choose these examples is these different interpretations lead to very different meanings. But here's the key thing. The meaning of things like the Bible, the meaning of things like the Constitution, it's not simply an academic exercise. This shapes the identity, these books and their meanings shape, and these texts, I should say, shape the identities of people, shape them as human beings and their outlook on the world, and shape communities. It shapes our nation, absolutely. Our nation could be defined by a dispute between how we understand the founding of our own country, right? Was it founded in 1776 and 1787, or was it founded in 1619? Something like that, right? So you see that there's really profound implications here. And I really want everyone to keep these ideas in mind as we read and move forward in this text and start getting to some of the fun things we're going to read. So thank you, and I will see you soon.